Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please ask any questions, make any comments. I try and keep an eye on those while we're talking. And this will, of course, be posted later. But first, welcome, Leah.
Thanks.
Yes, and for those of you joining us, I'm interviewing Leah Goodridge today, and she is a writer. She is currently a planning commissioner in New York for housing, and also a former tenants' rights lawyer. And so, what we really wanted to talk about today is the larger issue of housing, but particularly how media uh, frames the issue. And so I always jump in right away with the question of what do you think of the way media frames this issue of housing that is just so critical to people's lives, so important in our elections, both obviously locally in New York and nationally?
Yeah, I think that there can be more focus on tenant movements and tenant organizing. I don't think that a lot of people are aware that there is like a large grassroots
Mhm.
tenant organizing movement. So there are a lot of tenant unions, there are a lot of like little tenant organizers who organize tenants into larger movements or larger sort of like not necessarily nonprofits, but larger organizations, and
Collectives,
they get
really.
things done. Yeah. So I used to be the lawyer representing tenants who were facing eviction or had other housing issues. And I've got to say, even as a lawyer, like there's only so much you can do. I was on this rent guidelines board, the same board that Zoran talks about the rent freeze. And I was a lawyer on the board, obviously a tenant member. But what really moved things were the tenant organizers who
Mhm.
were literally organizing on the ground, making demands in ways that I think the average person is very difficult to do. And so I would say that covering that grassroots movement and covering more of it, because there is some, covering more of it would really make a huge difference. And I think that's what is missing.
It seems to me, and you and I have spoken briefly about this, that media disproportionately focuses, which we know at the Women's Media Center through studies, years of looking at auditing media, but they tend to focus, I think, more on as sources and in their framing on landlords and particularly on representatives right now, for example, of private equity. They're gobbling up
Right.
buildings. And so, in that context, there's this strange inversion, I think, of the idea of a mom and pop landlord or the power of um, the government to be oppressing these people. Can you talk about what that dynamic looks like and why it can be such a slippery and corrosive slope?
Yeah. When I first started seeing a shift, because I started representing tenants in court in 2012. And I saw a real shift in the public when the pandemic happened. And of course, courts were weighing whether to have a moratorium on evictions, which means just to stay the evictions because, you remember the beginning phases of the pandemic, we had
Yeah.
no idea what this was. And so imagine if people got evicted there on the street, that would have made a pandemic exacerbated it much worse than it was. So
Hmm.
we have this moratorium. And there were a lot of people who their thought process was poor landlords,
Yeah. They're not getting paid.
poor landlords, small and pop landlords, especially. And I understand it. I won't pretend to not understand it. But I will say that the shift there was sort of like, okay, well, what about tenants who might get evicted in the middle of
Oh, global
a
pandemic.
pandemic because a lot of people lost their jobs. And then we're talking like a month later, they were getting eviction notices like, okay, well, you didn't pay 1 month's rent. And so now you got to go. You lived there for 10 years. Oh, well, you got to go. And so these are the stories where you would expect someone to go, okay, poor tenant, right? How can we help? How can we have rental assistance? But a lot of it was, you know, those scamming tenants, how they're getting over
Right.
and
Demonizing them.
demonizing them, and then the small mom and pop landlords. When I practiced for about 12 years in housing court, I can count on one hand the number of mom and pop landlords I actually had on the other side. Most of
Really?
them were, yeah. So
They're big
this is
developers?
another thing. Yeah, they were large LLCs that often had attorneys on retainer. And so I think the other element of this for me, and again, I practiced for 12 years. I practiced in almost every county in New York City. So I was able to really see the gamut. And so I think that the other part of this for me is like how much sometimes there is using the small mom and pop uh, narrative, as a leverage to sort of gut tenant protections, because that's what's going on in
Right.
lawsuits.
That I think speaks really directly to another issue that at least I perceive in media coverage, which is because of the way narrative works, media will often frame or focus on an individual and not really cover in a meaningful analytical way the systemic and affordability issues. How does that sort of play out in your work, in your day-to-day work? Does that affect you? Like, I
Yeah,
mean, you're
I
dealing
mean,
with individuals all the time, right? But it is in
yeah.
fact the result of this larger problem.
Yeah, and this is one thing I really truly appreciate. And I will always be ride or die for its local media, right?
Mhm.
Because you have like in New York, you have WNYC, like Gothamist, you have the city. These are
Yeah.
city limits, these are publications that are very grassroots and they tend to cover, what I'm talking about. So when there was an issue where, the landlords have sued the city to try to attack rent stabilization, it was covered widely in
Right.
Gotham, right? So that they can inform New Yorkers about it. But that's an issue of affordability, because if we don't have rent stabilization and we're just relying on the private market now for housing, yes, that's going to have a huge dip in the market, because those are 1 million apartments. So
Mhm.
that was covered by local media.
Yeah, that makes me think too, though, about really the demise of local media, how critical it is to
Yeah.
understand the relationship between what's happening on the ground, in this case with tenants, and really just the disappearance of those media. I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm seeing a lot of former journalists at large organizations start to coalesce around local media, which I think is really critical. Um, but I hadn't, when we were talking earlier, I hadn't really thought about how important that was to this particular fight.
Yeah, I think, what so I'm in a role of, I guess you would say, semi-government official. But
Hmm.
for many years I wasn't, and I was, the tenant attorney, the social justice attorney, and I was working with tenants. So we often worked with local media, and I can tell you that I got to see the trust level. There are a lot of tenants who inherently will trust a local reporter. They have
Right.
built relationships.
They
But
know
now,
them.
when we sort of like go broader, they're like, no, I think that they're going to make me out to look bad. I don't know them,
Mm.
and so there's a very different relationship. So I do think that it is really important to have local press. And they do have a role, not just on what they cover, but also because people trust them.
Right.
It's not going to be the same thing as like I expect a hit piece because I spoke with someone about my eviction case, and then like
Hmm.
the piece ended up being about me as a tenant and how I owe rent and how I'm a scammer.
Right.
It's not, because they don't have time for that. It's that they don't
Hmm.
have time to do this sort of like
No,
so,
exactly.
they're just reporting the news to inform the public about what's
Hmm.
happening. So yeah, I really do praise local press, because I think that it has definitely made a difference, and it is very sad to see obviously the decimation of locals.
Yes.
I mean, some of the stories I've read, I'm like, what do you mean AI is go? What do you mean AI
I
reporter?
know. I
Right?
know.
You can't AI report like someone getting evicted. Like you can't
No.
AI report, some of the issues that are happening. So yeah.
Well, that's a good segue actually to my next question, which is that sometimes the language of housing affordability, tenants' rights is um, kind of cloaked in economics or abstractions about politics. Can you talk about the real violence of evictions, like what it really means in local neighborhoods to communities, particularly, um, I think, in terms of both racialized and gender displacement, that is just a kind of constant risk.
Yeah, when I first started representing people, I was very confused because most of these cases, they were getting evicted, and eviction is one of those things that if you don't file the legal motion, right, then there's not going to be a stop to it. So the marshal is coming. And in order to get a legal motion approved by the judge, then you need proof that, like, oh hey, I applied for this rental assistance program, so, and it's pending, so I'm doing something. But without
Mhm.
that, most of the time, especially if the case has gone on for a little bit, it's harder to do that. So I was confused when I started, and I would have clients sitting there, tenants, and I'm like, okay, the marshal's going to be coming. You need to go and apply for rental assistance. And they would just sit there and look, ahead. And I'm like, okay, come on, come on, come on. Because now I'd start getting anxious because I'm the lawyer, and I'm like,
Right.
I need you to,
You have to do this. You have
I
to do
can't
this.
apply for this. And when I realized that it was like, when I got to like maybe my fifth person, that's when it really clicked for me, like, oh, this isn't this individual tenant. This is a trauma response to being evicted. People are freezing.
Right.
People are
You're
literally
just sitting in place.
people are literally freezing. Sometimes I'd have someone and they would have like a 2-year-old daughter, and I'm like, you're gay, you gotta apply, you gotta go. And they would just sort of like zip
Mhm.
her, and then I'd realize, oh, this isn't work. Like me being like doing the whole, yeah, it's not working. I have to do something different because they're in a state of basic terror where they're not moving.
Right.
Um, so that was one area where I saw the trauma.
So what do you do?
I would try to have a paralegal or someone to work with them, and
Yeah.
I would change my framing of it. Like, I wouldn't, because before the whole like, if you don't do this, you're gonna get evicted. Like I realized that doesn't, when they know, right? So
Yes.
I would have to change it sort of like, hey, we're working on this project together, me and you, we're the lawyer. And then I would give them a checklist, like, here's what I'm doing, and here's what you
Right.
need to do. And then we're going to come back. It's almost like a team, like we're on a job.
Yeah, more mutual, sort of mutual collective support around someone as
Yeah.
opposed to go do this thing.
Yeah. So I'd say, okay, yeah, and then you're going to come back, and then, you have your checklist, and then I have mine, and then we're going to come back, and then we're going to meet in my office, and then we're going to go through, did you do this? And I think it just changed the whole, because I mean, I have to tell you, as a lawyer, when you have to, there's also a secondary trauma impact, right? Because you don't
Yes,
see your
absolutely.
client evicted. So you're like, I know the judge is not going to stamp this approval. So I know that you need to go to court. So you're also
Mm.
like, I need you to do, this is
Yes,
the
do it, do
lawyer,
it.
and it's coming from a good place. But when you get more experience, you realize it doesn't, 90% of the time, that doesn't work. And I've gone through this in my personal life as well.
Mhm.
I've gone through moments where I am facing depression, and you literally just freeze.
Yeah,
And
you can't
people,
move.
yeah, and people sort of yelling in your ear, telling you the impact of you freezing, all it does is make you freeze even more.
Right.
So I think I sort of just had to take a step back and go, how do I how do I work with, because this is another aspect too. Let me also point out, in law school, they don't train you to do this. That's the other thing too. In law school, they tell you, like, you are not the social worker. Go and get a social
That's right.
worker. Right. And so you're not, so when you're at these nonprofits, though, very unlikely that you're going to have a social worker. So you actually do have, this is the other thing they don't tell you, you do have to learn how to do this.
Right.
And it does become a part of your job. And maybe it's not specifically what should be the job of a lawyer per se, but when you are doing this work, you have to realize that your nonprofit isn't going to hire a social worker. And so you
Right.
do have to do it. You do have to learn how to do it.
I think that's interesting because as a journalist, I certainly have had this experience of secondary trauma, related. more to covering sexual violence. But,
Mm.
I think that at least in journalism now, there are dedicated tracks that, for trauma informed reporting. A lot of the time, though, that's focused on how the journalists themselves can recognize what's happening in the moment. But I do think that still in coverage of these issues, in parallel to what you're just saying, a lot of journalists interview people without necessarily thinking about that. The fact that these people
Mhm.
are in the middle of a trauma response when they're interviewing them, and that the coverage that they provide, if it were sensitive to that, would be significantly different, as opposed to here are the numbers, et cetera.
It's interesting you mentioned this because separate from what we're talking about, I wrote this article about the concept of professionalism and basically
Yes, yes.
deconstructing it. And one of the things I talked about was exactly what you're saying. And I think there's a parallel between lawyering and journalism here,
Absolutely.
because in law school they teach us like you are not necessarily supposed to like be heart to heart with your
Mhm.
client. Like you're supposed to have no emotions and think logically and be rational, right? That's what being a lawyer is. And I can't help but think that in journalism there was a whole controversy over especially like sexual assault victims
Absolutely.
covering Me Too
Yes.
movement and saying, you're going to have bias, you
You're
can't
not
cover it.
objective.
Right. But let me tell you, if you are a landlord or a developer, right, and you are a journalist, that's not considered a bias
Right.
to cover this. And trust me, I've seen some of them on Twitter. Some of them have come at me, and I'm thinking in the back of my head, why isn't this considered a
Yes.
bias? Right? Where's all of this that they have against like the Me Too survivors, right?
Yeah.
So
And nobody
people
ever
got
asks
fired
about
over
the
this.
journalists. Yeah, no one asks about the journalists who've been sexual aggressors.
Yeah.
I mean
Yeah.
that, I mean, you and I could talk about this for, weeks.
Yeah.
But yes, I think okay. So we have 10 more minutes and I have a couple more questions.
Okay.
One is how do you see the work that you've been doing relating to the national conversation about housing and federal housing policy? What do you think? Where do you see overlaps and deviations, or really, what do you think in general about the larger issue and the way that it's handled in media and politics?
I think that housing controls elections.
Mm.
I think housing as a topic, and I don't think that everyone is caught up with this yet. But if you really look at, for example, the candidacy of Zoran Mamdani,
Mhm.
he was a standout candidate because he was the only one who was talking about housing in a way that people recognized, right? He
Mhm.
said, I'm going to freeze the rent.
Right.
And people immediately said, okay, you get it, because a lot of other topics that people have been talking about, people, you can talk about those, but you also have to center affordability in
Mhm.
housing. And so I think that that resonated with people. And I think nationally, um, people care about housing, and that is the number one issue. I think it
Mhm.
controls a lot of other politics. Even, for example, whenever I have heard of now people in New York City is a very progressive city, despite, what some may say. And I have heard people make negative comments about immigration and they tie it, and then when I ask, they tie it to housing. So here's an example. Oh, I'm not able to find affordable housing, but New York City can somehow can give undocumented
Mm.
immigrants
Yes, the
vouchers for
deflection of the
housing.
resources.
Right. And I have never, I'm a born and raised New Yorker. I have never heard that until in the last few years. This is
Right.
something that for me, and I'm locked into these communities, and this is something that is like bubbling up
Mhm.
that I've been hearing a lot more, I would say, in the last 3 years. And
Right.
so I don't think that people understand that housing is at the forefront of literally everything, of politics, of
Yes.
how people think about immigration, of jobs. It's at the forefront, and so it has to be more of I think it has to be the sector
Right.
of politics going forward,
Explicitly, though.
instead of because when you say, oh, I'm going to make things more affordable, how, right? This is why Zoran won. He explained, he said in 2 words, I'm going to freeze the rent, that's it.
Right.
Freeze rent, that's it.
So that just happened.
Right.
And
Yeah.
how's it going? What do you think?
Yeah, it's gonna take it is for leases taking effect October
Mhm.
1st
Yes.
of this
But in
year.
terms of response and media, like how do you this is
Yeah.
happening. So
I was on the board that freezes the rent, and I was on it when it froze it twice before, and I think it's just that people are finding out about it because it became part of the national news with because it was
yes.
part of Mom Donnie's slogan. But I just want to say, we've already frozen the rent like multiple times, and New York City survived and did not crumble.
Mm.
So, because this is what landlords say, they're like, "Oh my God, how dare
Yeah.
you all? We're not going to survive. This is Armageddon."
So much backlash.
We survived. So a lot of backlash, but we will be fine.
Um, so I think that to your point about the centrality of affordability, I think that a lot of the issue of housing affordability has always been implicit. And in fact, I think it's good that it's explicit. Like I think of it myself as a very deeply intersectional feminist issue over decades, right? Like the housing policy, what it's tied to, what the affordability cascade is for families, especially families who aren't like heteropatriarchal normative,
Mhm.
like that standard in the government. And so I think it's a kind of an interesting time from that perspective. Um, in the shifts that you're seeing, do you feel like the the political culture is still lagging, or do you feel that there's a portion like this campaign that is at the forefront of things that could change nationally?
Um,
Or both of those things at once,
I'm going to be brutally honest.
Mm,
I think that the Democratic Party has a lot of work to do
mhm.
when it comes to understanding housing. I mean, even I think to some degree they have adopted it. This has become considered a progressive policy, and it's not. But basically, deregulating everything, abundance,
Mhm.
allowing private actors to sort of take over, private
Right.
developers. Which I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I am not like anti like, oh, there should never be any, private housing
Yeah.
anywhere at all. But what I'm talking about, you have to understand, I sit on the planning commission, so I literally get to see this play out and I
Right.
vote on it. I vote no oftentimes when it's unaffordable, but sometimes we have, not sometimes, a lot of the times, we have housing that comes through. The affordable housing piece is only 25%. That's number
Mhm.
one. And then number two is then that 25% is really for moderate income. In New
Right.
York City, affordable housing, the low income goes all the way up to $90,000 that you
Mhm.
qualify. So a lot of developers, they'll say, oh, well, if I can go up to $90,000, why am I going to choose someone who makes $30,000? I'm just going to, have a bunch of $90,000 income
Right.
tenants, right? And so that shuts out the folks that I represented, the Uber drivers,
Yeah.
the home health aides. So I think when we talk, to answer your question, I think when we are thinking about boldly about affordable housing, and housing in of itself, it has to really look at these issues of what we've been doing wrong. And that's one of the
Yes.
things. Like fake affordable housing is
Mhm.
definitely one of them. We have to invest. We have to have public investment
Right.
so that we can actually have deeply affordable housing.
Which I think, to wrap us up, because I know we're about to close, is also really salient to how media talks about it. Like,
Mm.
being able to focus on the fact that it's often papered over, that it's
Mm.
not a genuine effort. Um, all right, I'm going to close by saying thank you,
Thank
and
you.
it was delightful to talk to you. And also, can you tell people where they can find you and your work? This this video will be posted. It will live forever on the internet. But
Okay.
we'd like people to learn more about your writing and your
Yeah,
thinking.
sure. I met Leah from Brooklyn everywhere. So Leah from Brooklyn on Instagram. Brooklyn spelled BKLYN, and my first name is Leah. And so it's Leah from Brooklyn on IG, on Twitter, and then my website is also leahfrombrooklyn.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
joining us today. And I hope you stay cool and air conditioned in the heat.